Welcome to the Montana Libertarian Party meetup. The following is a video when we had Libertarian presidential candidate Jacon Hornberger visit us. I must apologize that I failed to start the recording at the beginning of that visit. So this recording is missing approximately the first 10 minutes, but I hope the remaining recording will give you a good look at the candidate. So without further ado, Jacon Hornberger.
Of living were growing by leaps and bounds. Can you guys still
Yeah,
hear
I
me?
can hear you.
Okay. If you look like 1870 to 1910, it's the most incredible period I consider in the history of mankind. And there was so much voluntary charity when people were free to accumulate wealth that it was almost mind-boggling. When Alexis de Tocqueville came over, I forget when he came over, 1840 or whatever, he marveled at this strange American system because there was a voluntary association for everything. Now, there were, charitable organizations, but not like we think them in terms of tax-exempt organizations. They were just charitable organizations that people were donating their money to because there was no income tax. But they proved that this is what happens in a free society. That is, people accumulate wealth, they start developing a higher sense of consciousness of what should I do with my money. That's how the churches got built. That's how the museums got built, the opera houses. And then there was all these voluntary organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous and this and that, tons of them. That's what I see happening when you get rid of this mandatory coercion. This notion that Dave was bringing up about what do you do with the younger generation? They're not responsible. Well, with all due respect, I remember that being said about my generation. I mean, oh, what's happening? Look they're all a bunch of hippies, anti-war protesters. They're irresponsible, love children and all this. Well, everybody's got to learn his own lessons in life, that if you squander your money and you don't save for retirement, well, then when that day comes, you got to rely on others for assistance, or you got to keep working. And there's a lot of people that are working in their senior years, including me. There's nothing wrong with working. I enjoy it. And I know a lot of other seniors do too. But this notion that government has to be the protector, the guider, that's what has been so disastrous for this country. That we've got to restore the sense of self-reliance and voluntary charity and looking out for ourselves and looking out for others. Let me give you a real life example of this phenomenon. I grew up in Laredo, Texas, on the U.S.-Mexico border. We were told that Laredo in the 50s was the poorest city in the United States per capita income. And it was poor. I mean, it was extremely poor. There were people living in literal shacks in the barrios there in Laredo. Every day, the doctor's offices were filled with patients, including from Nuevo Laredo, Mexico. And the doctors knew that maybe more than half of the patients could not pay. And there wasn't one instance that I ever heard of where any doctor turned away a patient for inability to pay. They just handled it. And they were the second wealthiest people in town, second only to the oil people, because they were making plenty of money off those people who were paying. But they just felt it was their duty to pay back and furnish this free assistance. Some of the patients would come and bring them a chicken or whatever to try to compensate. They didn't have the money. But that's what life's all about. Would that happen again? There is no doubt in my mind, none, that there'd be doctors and hospitals willing to help out people that are no longer on Medicare. That's that faith we need to restore. I'll give you one more example of this. My dentist, former dentist, he's retired now. There's no Medicare or Medicaid for dental care, as y'all may know. So what these guys did, my dentist, about 5 other dentists, is they decided to devote 1 day a week on a rotating basis to handle free dental care to the poor. And so every week, the poor would come in and one of the dentists, one of the 6 or so, would handle them all for free. This is the faith in freedom that we need to restore in this country.
I actually had a little bit of an angle when I asked that question. Is one of the things that they did when they created nonprofits, suddenly churches were being threatened to have their nonprofit status taken away if they had any political discussion in church, right? So, if you go back to the founding of our country, the churches are where people met. The churches are where they stored their weapons. And it just seems like that was a huge blow to not be able to come together as a community, whether you're religious or not. I mean, if you go to a nonprofit and you speak and you have any kind of political, if you promote somebody over somebody else politically, you can have your nonprofit status threatened. So that's one of the areas I was going off into.
No, that's a fantastic point, because that's how they control you. I mean, why shouldn't a church be able to endorse a candidate? Think about it. I mean, if that's what the parishioners want to do, why not? But it's because of the income tax. The income tax inverted everything in America. Before the income tax, people were the masters and government was the servant. With the income tax, people became the servants and government became the master. And you then get this nonprofit business, which is what you're talking about. You have to get that. You'll have your exemption revoked if you're a church and you endorse a candidate. Well, if with no income tax, the church could do whatever it wants, and that's why the root of the problem is get rid of that tax.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Jacob, I do. Could you expound some on how you would, with the funding, but actually, I've heard you speak on this some, but if you'd tell us what you think about security, so police, things of that nature, how the funding aspect of it, who would do it, in a paradigm that you see in the future.
Yeah, I'm not an anarchist. I think anarchy is a inherently defective paradigm. I think you need to have a monopoly of force, government, that resolves disputes between people. So I see three essential functions of government generally: to provide a court system where people can resolve their disputes in civil disputes, suing each other. And when there's a final judgment, whoever loses, loses, and that's it, after appeals and so forth. And then the state enforces that judgment against the loser. The second is to protect the nation from an invasion. So if some foreign country invades the United States, government's purpose is to mobilize the citizenry and organize that fight. And the third one is to prosecute violent people or fraudulent people, murderers, rapists, thieves, and so forth. And that's it for all practical purposes. Now, we have to talk about the federal level and the state level. In the federal level, I think criminal justice doesn't belong there. I think you need a justice department because there may be civil suits involved, but the criminal justice should be at the state and federal level, state and local level. This notion of the FBI has been just a horrific disaster. I mean, this is one of the most tyrannical agencies in the history of this country. What they've done with COINTELPRO and spying on people and blackmailing people, and why we let them stay in existence. I mean, maybe they're just too powerful. So there would be a basic military for dismantle the national security state. That was the worst mistake we've ever made in this country, is converting the federal government from a limited government republic to a national security state. I'm referring to the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA. Get rid of them all and restore a limited government republic that is bound by the restrictions and powers in the Constitution. The national security state is not bound by the Constitution. They can violate the Constitution with impunity. And so, and with just a basic military force, relatively small, get rid of all these military bases, both foreign and domestic. I mean, what do you need all these domestic military bases for? Well, what are they protecting us from? There is absolutely no possibility, none, that any nation state around today could invade the United States. None. Nobody's got the money. Nobody's got the means to cross the oceans and invade. Nobody's got the interest in even trying such an impossible feat. Nobody's got the military, the manpower, the equipment, the supply lines. All you need is a small basic. All right. So at the state and local level, obviously you need the police, you need a prosecutor, a district attorney's office to prosecute the violent criminals, and court system, people suing in the court system. So there you have your division of powers. Now, the question you raise is, how do you fund this? And the founding fathers, our ancestors, said, well, we don't want any direct taxes like an income tax because they're too intrusive. They're too tyrannical. So they favored indirect taxes like tariffs, which is a sales tax on foreign products, or excise taxes, a sales tax on alcohol, which is indirect. Now, so, but notice something important, that the expenditures of government are minimal under my paradigm. You no longer have Social Security, Medicare, which are the two largest items. You no longer have the National Security Establishment. Those are your three largest items in the budget. You get rid of those immediately. You don't need an income tax. One of my opponents wants to replace the income tax with a sales tax of 18 to 23%. It's ridiculous. You don't need that. Just get rid of all of these social welfare programs, the warfare state. You've got now minimal expenses associated with what I said, the Justice Department. You need a Treasury Department. How do you fund this? I say you fund it voluntarily with donations or raffles or whatever. And now, would people volunteer? Now, remember, the government still has its monopoly of force to impose its will, like on a civil judgment, enforce that judgment. But the money that's funding this is voluntary. Would people voluntarily fund government, especially if it's a minimal size? There's no doubt in my mind. I mean, most people believe in government. So they would send their donations into the Treasury Department. The Treasury Department would compile all the donations. Congress would decide how to allocate those funds, whatever they may be. Same thing with state and local government. Everything voluntary. And people and governments would just have to learn within their means, to live within their means. If people don't donate as much as they want, well, then you just cut expenditures and you live within your means. Now, there's been actually I wrote a series on this called "Why I Favor Limited Government" that you can see online. There's been actually examples of voluntarily funded regimes in history, but I recently read about the Vatican. I didn't know this, but the Vatican convicted this archbishop of fraud or embezzlement, something like that, and they sentenced him to a certain time in jail there in the Vatican. Now, the Vatican is a country, very small. I think it's like a mile in diameter or something. But I thought, this is fascinating. I didn't know that they had a court system there. And so I looked it up to see how it was funded, because, taxation is force. And it was hard for me to believe that the churches are initiating force against people and foreclosing to collect taxes. Turns out the Vatican is entirely voluntarily funded. There is no taxation. And I thought, well, this is fascinating. That's an example of what I'm saying, a voluntarily funded limited government. So you have no violation of the libertarian non-aggression principle under my paradigm, none. Under my opponent, there is tons of violations of the libertarian non-aggression principle. Now, we have gotten to a point in this party where that's given short shrift. It's like, oh, Jacob, why are you bringing that up? That's, no big deal. It is a big deal. It's a big deal to me. This is the core principle of our philosophy. And, oh, by the way, we also sign a pledge in this party. Every single person who joins this party signs a pledge vowing not to support the initiation of force. And yet we do. I don't. But when you support a program like school vouchers or any other of these reform vehicles, you are supporting the initiation of force in violation of those two things. For me, that's highly problematic, because I think it then goes back again to voters. Why would voters vote for a party that expounds principles and takes vows when at the same time it advocates policies and programs that violate those two things? I wouldn't vote for a party like that.
We got a question up here from Liam. Yeah, so you talked a little bit about the financial side of the warfare state, but I just want your read on Biden's foreign policy right now. I mean, it really does seem like we are creeping toward a regional conflict, if not a worldwide conflict, and there are many tripwires. Biden's bombing Iraq and Syria seems every other day now, if not every day, and we are still involved in Ukraine, and people are saying that it appears to be ending, but I'm not so sure. It seems like anything could happen any day to kick it off again, especially if something happens in Syria that involves the U.S. directly with Russia. So I just want to get your take on it all.
Well, we've been playing this whack-a-mole for many, many years with these foreign wars, and the Libertarian Party candidates and the Libertarian Party hierarchy and everything. Notice that you hit one war and you bash the war and you have conferences and anywhere rallies, and then all of a sudden you got another war right on the heels of the previous one. So you bash that one, Ukraine, Vietnam, and then all of a sudden Persian Gulf War, and then the invasion of Afghanistan, and then Iraq, and oh, by the way, we just got out of Afghanistan. Can we have a little self-analysis on that? No. Oh, we got a new war in Ukraine. Oh boy. Oh wait a minute. Wait, there's Yemen. So you see, it's not Biden that's the problem here. It's this mindset of whack-a-mole that characterizes people in this movement, in this party. There is a root cause of all this whack-a-mole. And I'm the only candidate in this race that emphasizes this, that it's like a weed. When you're a kid, when I was a kid, I grew up on a farm. My dad taught me that to get rid of a weed, you have to pull it out by its root. You can't just trim its branches because it's just going to come back stronger. And so, ending one war, this war, I mean, you mentioned a bunch of them there, Liam, and there's always one available. And because the root of the problem is the national security state form of governmental structure that we have. And that's the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA. They are the ones that are truly running this country, not Biden. They're in charge of the federal government. And I'm not the only guy who says this. There's a guy named Michael J. Glennon, who's a professor of law at Tufts University. And he was a former counsel to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So he's not just a quack. He's written a book called National Security and Double Government that I wish every American would read. And his thesis, to which I subscribe, is that the people that are running the federal government, they're in charge, are the national security state people. Pentagon, CIA, and NSA, the military-industrial complex. They permit the other three branches to have the veneer of power because they don't care about appearances, but they're running the show. So they're the ones that are orchestrating this, and they're geniuses at it. Notice that when they use NATO to keep going eastward, they know exactly what they're doing. They're trying their best to get to a point where they've got a standby crisis. So if things don't work out in Afghanistan, immediately, as soon as they're kicked out of Afghanistan, they pull the trigger. Bam, you've got a new crisis over there. Russia invades Ukraine. Because all that Russia was waiting for was invite Ukraine into NATO, and Russia had promised to invade. For 20 years, they've promised to invade if that happened. And so, bam, the invitation is extended, the invasion takes place. All of a sudden, everybody's focus is on those bad Russians. And then you've got now this Middle East crisis, where war can break out in any number of places, Iran, Yemen, whatever. We have to get to the bottom of this, and that is dismantle the entire national security state. Pull this weed out by its root. Because if you pull that out by its root, you won't have these wars anymore. These are the people that are causing it. Let me give you one last supportive piece of evidence for this. There's a great new book out called The Last Honest Man by James Risen, a New York Times reporter. It's about Frank Church, who headed up the Church Committee in the 1970s about the CIA and all of its assassinations. Risen points out the Church got it. He had a breakthrough where he said, you know what? Getting out of Vietnam, and he was a fierce opponent of the Vietnam War while it was going on, it's not enough. He says, because there's going to be one right behind it. And in order to get rid of these foreign wars, you've got to get rid of this type of governmental system, the national security state. So when you talk about Biden's foreign policy, for me, it's not Biden. If it's not Biden, it's Trump. It's because it's the military industrial complex that's in charge, not Trump, not Biden, and not anybody else who's president of the United States.
Thank you for that. I couldn't agree more. I just finished The Devil's Chessboard by David Talbot about Allen Dulles, and I do agree that the CIA is very much the problem and their regime change operations since 1953 with Iran. It just seems to be the same exact model over and over again, and it does need to be uprooted.
Well, that is a great book. David Talbot's Devil's Chessboard, I would highly recommend to everybody. And it revolves around the Kennedy assassination, which, as y'all may know, I've done a lot of work in. I've published several books at the Future of Freedom Foundation, including books that I've authored. And I think it's time for a Libertarian Party presidential candidate to make an issue of this. No Libertarian Party presidential candidate has ever made an issue. I mean, here they took out a president of the United States, the CIA, the Pentagon, and yet there's silence, including among my opponents. I never hear any of my opponents condemning this assassination. And wouldn't it be nice to have a Libertarian Party presidential candidate that's over there reinforcing what Bobby Kennedy Jr. is saying, that there's a cover-up, that they won't release the rest of the documents, but that in fact it was the national security state that carried out this regime change operation. And I think it's time that the Libertarian Party presidential candidate starts making that an issue, along with Bobby Kennedy.
Hey, Matt, I see you have a question. Why don't you go ahead, bud? Here, okay.
I did have a question. I was just going to ask, in regards to your campaign and for some context for the question, Argentina just recently elected a president that is self-identifying as a libertarian. And he ran a very charismatic campaign. He appeared at rallies with a chainsaw, talking about cutting government spending, cutting government agencies. And it took him a while to gain popularity, but it seems like it really resounded with the people of Argentina. So my question is, how do you plan to stand out from the crowd? How do you plan to really make your message impactful?
Well, I haven't really studied much about Malay, but from what the little I know is that he was going to rallies with a chainsaw, saying that this is what he was going to do to government agencies and departments and so forth. I know that he named two of his dogs, Murray Rothbard and Milton Friedman, which was pretty credible for me. But you see, for 25 years minimum, the notion has been this party that our libertarian principles, the principles I'm enunciating, are liabilities. They're negatives, that they cost us votes. And that's where this movement to water down the message with reform came into existence. Oh, well, if we give American voters something that they like school vouchers and Social Security privatization and opt-outs and health savings accounts and Medicare, we don't do anything radical, we'll get votes. Well, who were they targeting? They're targeting the average kind of person that attends LP conventions, who's a white middle-class person. I mean, you go to any Libertarian Party convention, and 98% of the attendees will be white middle-class people or upper middle class, maybe wealthy. Okay, so it's logical they think, oh, well, we need to target people like us. If we could achieve this breakthrough, they can too. And so let's give them something respectable, like school vouchers, instead of calling for abolishing public schooling, because they're not going to go for that. Well, it's been a fallacious notion. I mean, for one thing, it's turning your back on your own principles. advocating principles that violate the libertarian non-aggression principle. But those people in the middle class, white middle class, are never going to vote for libertarians. That's been the fantasy. That's the pipe dream. Why? Because they're too comfortable. Okay, yeah, they're getting squeezed by inflation like everybody else. But okay, what does that mean? They adjust. They knock out a couple of movies a month, or they don't take their car to get washed as much. They adjust, but they're not going to go with radical stuff with the Libertarian Party. And that was the reason why this movement to turn away from the radical principles of libertarianism, which is what I favor. Well, if you look at my platform, there is no way that any average middle-class person would ever vote for me. Okay? And no Republican would ever vote for me. No Democrat would ever vote for me. I don't care. Okay, I couldn't care less about those people because they're not going to vote for us anyway. That the people are going to vote. We have our block of voters out there, and that's what a lot of LP members do not realize. That we have a block of voters that will vote for our set of principles. You can't see them. They don't come to the party. They don't join the party, but they will vote for us. And those are the people at the bottom of the economic ladder, the people that are getting crunched by the system, the drug war, crunched by inflation, people barely able to make it. They're, paycheck to paycheck. People that don't vote. 50% of Americans don't vote. Why? Because they say the whole system sucks, and they're right. But they're not going to vote for a reform candidate, a reform presidential, because they see that reform-oriented candidate as part of the system. So you call for school vouchers, or you want to continue Social Security, you want to continue Medicare, you're part of the system. You want to continue immigration controls. We haven't talked about immigration here. All of my opponents favor immigration controls, okay? But that makes you part of the system. They're never going to take the time to go to the polls to vote for an LP presidential candidate. That's the 1%, okay? The 2 Wall Street Journal polls are already saying we get 1%. I'm saying that with my message, that message of pure libertarianism attracts the block of voters at the bottom of the economic ladder. And I think, without knowing for sure, that's what Milei did in Argentina. Because the well-to-do in Argentina could survive their inflationary holocaust there. But the people at the bottom, I'm willing to bet that's where he oriented his campaign. This is the cause of your suffering and your misery. And they understood it. Now, the same thing here. Let me give you a real life example of this. 20 years ago, I ran for U.S. Senate in Virginia. Statewide race with the same message. My message has not changed, okay? Just the same message of principle. I was running against the most popular governor in the history of the state, or at least one of them, John Warner, head chairman of the Armed Services Committee. This was 2 years after the 9/11 attacks. I was saying that U.S. foreign policy was the motivating factor behind those attacks. So I knew I would not get one Republican vote. Okay, I didn't care. The Democrats weren't running anybody, but the LaRouches ran a candidate. One of my opponents attacked me the other day in one of the debates and said, oh, well, the reason you did so well is because the Democrats weren't running anybody. Well, that's ludicrous. What Democrat is going to vote for me? I'm calling for the abolition of public schooling immediately, Social Security immediately, Medicare immediately. There is no possibility that any Democrat would vote for me. In all likelihood, any Democrat that went to the polls voted for the LaRouche. I didn't care about that either. I ran a straight, pure libertarian campaign. Now, this was 2 years after Harry Brown ran in the 2000 presidential election, where he got 0.03% with a Social Security reform plan. And he didn't come out for open borders. I'm coming out with a campaign 2 years later, open borders, abolish Social Security, abolish Medicare, abolish public schooling, straight across the board of what we talked about here, legalize all drugs. So I walked into I campaigned heavily among blacks here in Virginia. I found out where their picnics were, their concerts were, went out, handed my material. I went and visited one of the most prominent black ministers in the country, a man named John O. Peterson, for the Alfred Street Baptist Church. He got elected to the African American Hall of Fame. And I made an appointment to see him. And I went in there and I said, this is where I stand, Pastor Peterson. I want to abolish all welfare programs, including Social Security and Medicare. I want to get rid of the public school system. I want to open the borders. I'm tired of the death and suffering down there. I want to legalize all drugs because of what it's done to people in the Black community, or at least part reason. And at the end of about a 2-hour conversation, he says, Mr. Hornberger, I'm going to endorse your candidacy. He knew I couldn't win, but he gives me a written letter of endorsement. He says, take this to every Black minister in the state, tell him I'm endorsing you. And I did that. And I ended up with 7% of the statewide vote. Now, this is compared to Harry Brown's 0.03. Now, I didn't say 0.07. I said 7% of the statewide vote. And to this day, I have no doubts that the lion's share of those votes came from the Black community. Because Blacks have been, just tyrannized with this drug war. And I had the same experience in North Carolina 3 years ago when I was seeking the party's nomination. I campaigned heavily in North Carolina among Blacks, and I got a resounding response there too. So that's what I would do in this race. The message itself finds the people who are interested. When I'm calling for open borders, there's a lot that generates its own publicity. In North Carolina, I walked into a Hispanic newspaper. And the woman comes out and says, may I help you? I said, I'm seeking the Libertarian Party presidential nomination. I wanted to come in and see if you might, do a profile on my campaign. And she said, well, what's your campaign about? And so I immediately started speaking Spanish to her. And I said, I want to open the borders, total open the borders, no border patrol, no immigration service, nothing. She says, wait right here. She comes back with her editor and says, tell her what you just told me. And I told her, and the editor says, we'd like you to come back for a full interview. I came back, it was a 2-hour interview, and they published it in their newspaper. So these messages, this is what LP members do not realize, that our radical principles generate their own controversy. Imagine an LP candidate unabashedly saying, I want to abolish Social Security. I mean, that'll drive people ballistic. Oh my gosh, we can't believe this. So you generate, and then you find that block of voters out there that will vote. I got 7% 20 years ago. Think of the strides. This was before anybody even knew what libertarianism was about. 20 years later, after all these strides we've made, libertarianism is a household term. I have no doubts I could double that from 7% to 14%. No doubts at all. Not because of anything about me, but because this message, and this is the thing of restoring faith in our own principles in this party. There's people out there that will vote for us, including Black people, including Hispanics, that are sick and tired of what's happening at the border. They just don't know there's a viable alternative. When all of a sudden they hear that there's a candidate out there making the competent case for open borders, the religious case, the moral case, the economic case, the ethical case, they will leap. They will leap, and there's your 10 to 15% breakout. But it's concentrating on a segment of society that LP members are not accustomed to targeting. We're targeting Republicans. Party of Ron Paul, party of Ron Paul. How often do you hear that? Well, Ron Paul was a Republican. So what they're saying is, let's go target those Republicans that voted for Ron Paul. Republicans are never going to vote for a Libertarian Party candidate. We have to find our own Ron Paul type voters, our own Donald Trump voters, the people that love our principles, our own block of votes that are fiercely loyal to us, even if they don't join the party. Let's say that I were to get 15% of the national vote, and most of it, 80% of it came in with Blacks and Hispanics, none of whom joined the party. Would anybody really care where these votes come from? Should that matter that they didn't come from white middle-class America? I don't think so. Our job's to get votes. And so what if they come from a sector of society that we're not accustomed to campaigning in? That's my position is, shoot, get the votes. Don't worry about where they're coming from.
Thanks for answering.
Okay. And, I like the that flag in the back because it looks like you got a hat. I know you got a cap, but it looks like a hat back there.
He looks like Vernon Supreme.
Yeah, exactly. A boot on there.
I I'd just like you to maybe expound on the border issue because I know that it is a conflicting one even within the party, and I myself am sometimes internally divided on this because, for instance, what's happening currently between Texas and the national government, I wonder what you would say to the more Ron Paul segment of this party and the Mises crowd who are in favor of private borders and are also in favor of decentralization, and believe that what's going on right now is the federal government is actually tyrannizing Texas and using its federal powers to maybe abandon federalist principles and stuff like that.
There are not two positions on immigration in the Libertarian Party or the Libertarian philosophy any more than there's two issues on drug laws. There's some people that do not want to legalize heroin, cocaine, meth. Well, that doesn't make that a libertarian position. It's just that they can't bring themselves to accept that the libertarian position is legalize all drugs. You have a right to ingest whatever you want. There's only one libertarian position on immigration. Either one is right and the other is wrong, or vice versa. And there is no question but that the only libertarian position is open borders, the free movements of goods, services, and people across borders, as compared to the government controlling who crosses a border through the use of force. Now, how do we determine which one is the genuine libertarian position? Through our core principle, the non-aggression principle, that when you cross a border, a political border, using the international bridge, you're not violating anybody's rights. For example, when I drive into Maryland, I cross the Potomac River. As soon as I cross that bridge, I haven't violated anybody's rights. When you cross from Texas into Oklahoma, and it says, "Welcome to Oklahoma," you haven't violated anybody's rights. And so the mere crossing of a border does not violate rights. What's going on here is that the people that support this system of immigration controls are supporting a system that is really a socialist system. I grew up on the border. I grew up on a farm on the Rio Grande. We hired illegal immigrants. They were the hardest working people I've ever seen. I lived almost half my life on the border. I know border culture, and I had my own run-ins with the Border Patrol. And I've seen this death and suffering down there. And I can assure you that this philosophy of libertarianism is not a philosophy of Border Patrol, highway checkpoints, warrantless searches of farms and ranches, death, suffering. It is a philosophy of life, of prosperity, of vitality, of harmony. And what we have here is a socialist system. What do I mean by that? Well, it's based on the socialist concept of central planning, which, as Mises pointed out, produces planned chaos. I mean, that's what the whole Soviet Union was all about, central planning. You've got government officials that are planning a complex labor movement in a complex labor market, one of the most complex in history. Millions of people allocating how many overall should come in, allocating to each country how many, what their credentials should be, how long the process is going to be. When you have a central planning system like this, as compared to a spontaneous market, you're going to have crisis. You're going to have chaos. Mises called it planned chaos. My point is this: the only reason you have a perpetual crisis ongoing, decades long, all my life. I've seen this crisis. It has never gone away, is because of the system. Okay. So what do they do about this crisis? Instead of getting rid of the cause of the crisis, which is the immigration control system, they double down and they say, oh, wait, we've got to really stop these people who are circumventing the controls. You see, it starts out with just a do not enter sign. Do not enter. Okay. And that's it. Just a sign there that says do not enter. Do not cross this bridge without permission. And people laugh because people have always moved to seek a better way of life or to go visit or tour or visit, whatever. So they just laugh because there's no guards there. So the government says, well, we need to put guards there at the border, at the checkpoint. Crossing the border, we have to check people's papers. So then people start circumventing. They swim across the river. They trespass on a private farm, ranch. They head on up north to get a job. Oh, well, now we need a border patrol. And then we need more border patrol. And we need warrantless searches. They would come onto our farm on the Rio Grande with no warrant whenever they wanted. If we put a lock on our gate, they would shoot off the lock. This is what life's like under a police state. They got highway checkpoints. When you leave Laredo, you come to go to San Antonio on I-35, you come over the crest of a hill, and all of a sudden you think you're in Mexico because there's this immigration station there, permanent station, where they can search your car, ask for your papers, and these checkpoints exist all in the Southwest along the border, going east-west. People have never entered Mexico have to stop and be subjected to searches. That's how Willie Nelson got busted for marijuana. In other words, there's a police state down there because a police state comes with this socialist system. It's inevitable. It's like thunder and lightning because you have to enforce this system. So every libertarian, and these are all my opponents, that favor this system, favor a police state too. They won't say that, but it's like saying I favor lightning and therefore I favor thunder, because the police state comes with this system. So what is the solution to this? Well, there is only one solution. I've been saying this for 30 years, because you look at all the crises. You look at the refugee camps. You look at the people flooding across, trespassing on farms and ranches. You see the refugee centers in New York and Chicago, and you think, oh my gosh, this is open borders. No, it's not. It's people circumventing their police state. That's why it feels so monumental, because they've got this police state. They send troops down there. They build a Berlin Wall, and still people circumvent. It's proof that their system isn't working. It's not proof of open borders. Now, what happens if you adopt my position today? And that's what I advocate. Eliminate the Border Patrol. Eliminate the Immigration Service. Eliminate all controls on the crossing at that international bridge in Laredo and all other border crossings, just like we have between Maryland and Virginia. And every state here, we don't have any controls on the free movements across state borders. That's what I want. Free movements of people. Immediately, the crisis disappears. Oh, and leave people free to work. Because you see, they can't work. I mean, how can they avoid being refugees when you're not letting them work because of this stupid green card system? You know, just leave people alone. You don't need the government to establish refugee centers. Just leave people alone. They will come and manage on their own. They will figure out how to do it. If they're going to make their way here to get a job, they'll find their job, or they'll find family to take care of them in the meantime. You don't need government refugee centers. But all of a sudden, this big conglomeration of people goes away. You won't even notice who's here that's not a citizen. You won't care. You know, like when you go into McDonald's right now and somebody's speaking Spanish in the back, do you go and say, I'd like to see if you're an American citizen? No, you don't care if he is or isn't. And that's what happens with open borders. People coming in, you don't know whether they're American citizens or not. When you start interacting with them, you don't care. In Laredo, when I was a kid, we would celebrate George Washington's birthday in Laredo, Texas, which was part of the Mexican country that the U.S. stole, part of the Spanish Empire. 98%, maybe 99% of Laredoans were Mexican American. Not surprising; it was part of Mexico. And when I would do jury panels practicing law, I would say at least 20% of the jury panel could not speak or write English and had to be disqualified. This is what, a couple hundred years after we absorbed Mexico, they couldn't speak or write English. A totally different culture. So when I was a kid, and we'd celebrate George Washington's birthday with a week-long series of celebrations, a debutante's ball, a big parade with floats and the debutantes, and Pocahontas leading the parade on a horse. They would open the border. The Border Patrol would stand down, the Immigration Service would stand down, everybody in Nuevo Laredo would come over and share in the festivities. You couldn't tell who was a Mexican and who wasn't. I mean, everybody speaks Spanish anyway. So if you went to like one of the plazas where they'd have Noche Mexicana or the Jalapeno Festival or whatever, you couldn't tell who was a Mexican and who wasn't, because everybody in Laredo was speaking Spanish too, or most everybody. Nobody cared. And that's my point. You get rid of this socialist system, tomorrow the crisis is over, the death is gone, the suffering, and so forth. Unfortunately, all too many Americans cannot bring to themselves to do that because they're too vested. We've grown up under this system. We can't imagine what freedom would be like. I just wrote an article today where I said, imagine if they put border controls on between Virginia and Maryland. That 235,000 cars travel across the border every day between Maryland and Virginia. Imagine if they put border controls today to protect us from violent criminals coming in, people with COVID, terrorists. There would be an immediate backlog of cars at the bridge there in Maryland coming in. I mean, huge backlog. And then so people would circumvent and say, well, let's go over there to Point of Rocks and let's cross over there. So Virginia puts a border crossing guard there. People start using a ferry to get across the Potomac. Oh, we need a border patrol. And so all of a sudden, all this crisis, and what would people be saying? You got to do something. Comprehensive border reform and stuff. I come along and say, no, all you got to do is lift the controls, and the crisis will be over. And everybody, oh my gosh, Jacob, you radical libertarians. But we can see it. See, when we look at domestically, we can see how logical it is. That with the big backlog of cars from the controls, just lift the controls, get rid of the border checkpoints, and everything starts flowing smoothly. That's what would happen along the border. It's the only solution. I've been saying this for 30 years. I feel like I'm beating my head against the wall. There is only one solution. It's not a crackdown. The more they crack down, the worse the police state gets down there. And the only solution is freedom and free markets, free movements of goods, services, and people across borders. So all these, and let me give you the political angle here, though. This is the really funny part, too. Okay, I keep telling you that this reform message cannot garner votes. 1%. Imagine, the party's been in existence over 50 years, and all they can get is 1% in the presidential race. Well, my opponents say Jacob's position cannot garner votes. Here they are. Imagine the irony. They're sitting there with 1% of the vote chronically. The Wall Street Journal polls are already saying we're going to get 1% 2024. And they're saying that my position can't get votes? Come on. Their position cannot get votes. You see, they think that because most Americans favor immigration controls, that's a political asset for all of my opponents. And they all believe in the system. Some are more flexible. They want the government to let in more immigrants. Others, man, fierce. They want to finish the wall. And so the idea is that, well, because let's say 70% of Americans or 80% of Americans favor immigration controls, that's a political asset that will garner votes. It doesn't. Guess how many votes that position gets for LP presidential candidates? 0. I'm talking about people outside the party. 0. Now, why is that? Well, because every proponent of immigration controls is going to vote for Trump. Okay? Trump's your premier immigration controller. Or before him, DeSantis. I mean, he may even make DeSantis his vice presidential candidate. No proponent of immigration controls is going to waste his vote on a libertarian. Why would he? Trump's going to be saying, stop the steal a second time. flood the ballot box with your votes, which is what he did in New Hampshire. Go to the polls and flood it with votes. That's what he's going to be saying in the general election. 0 votes for the LP presidential candidate. The only votes he's going to get are from the immigration controllers inside the party. What about my position? Open borders. Well, like I say, there is a body of people out there that hate this system. They hate it with a passion, the death, the suffering. They don't know that there's an alternative. But when they hear there's an alternative, they will leap at it, because mostly Hispanics, they see the death, the people drowning, the people, the backs of tractor trailers. I can get those votes. They will never vote for a libertarian immigration controller. Never in a million years. They will vote for Biden, or they'll stay at home. But give them a person that says, here's what I stand for, open borders. And I've tested it before on Hispanics. I speak fluent Spanish, and I say, this is what I favor. And they look at me and say, if only, if only, if only. Those are my voters. And those are voters that my opponents cannot get. They lock them out. So from a political standpoint, my position is a vote getter. Their position is a vote non-getter. And that's why they're at 1%.
Thank you.
Okay, on a totally different topic, and this is not something really the president can do, but other than the bully pulpit, in the world of craziness, yeah, really crazy. How do you stand on the wonderful one? Again, it's not something the president can do, but one of the crazy things that's going on these days is the transgender movement. Especially as it deals with children. Where do you stand on that? Surgery and hormone treatment.
Well, let's start with adults. I think people should be free to live their lives any way they choose.
Yeah.
And if somebody wants to do whatever to his own body, he's got the absolute right to do that. And I know that there's libertarians that engage in transgender bashing and bashing people and ridiculing people and mocking people that have gone down that road. That's not for me.
Oh yeah.
I don't.
It applies to children. Yeah.
Yeah, children. When I served 3 terms on the platform committee back in the 90s, and the children's rights plank was always the most difficult to craft. There was always discussions, debates, and so forth, because children's rights are so difficult to define in many instances. And it's like, where do you draw the line? And okay, whatever the age of consent is going to be arbitrary. We've defined it as 18, but a state might change that to 19 or 17. But whatever that age of consent is, and I kind of like 18. I think it seems rather legitimate. That I believe that no parent should have the authority to initiate any kind of surgery or life-changing alteration of a child. I'm a firm believer in the autonomy of the family, that people have a right to bring up their children the way they want without state interference. But there's limits. I mean, we don't allow parents to engage in sex abuse. We want the state to intervene there. But what about offering a kid a glass of wine that's 16 years old at dinner? Well, okay, things get a little bit dicier then. I'm not sure I see a big problem with that. But when you're talking about life-changing surgery or any kind of other medical procedure that's life-changing, I say draw the line there. To me, that the person's got to be of age of consent to make that determination. Now, as far as counseling or talking and so forth, I say people should be free to do that. I mean, there's nothing, talking to a child. If a child is saying that he's identifying as a person of the opposite sex, talk to him, counsel him, try to encourage whatever you can, and let the family make those determinations and decisions. But as far as the life-changing alterations, I say no, the state should stop that.
Yep. Well, I also noticed on your website, the Libertarian Party, about 2 years ago, decided that they were not going to take any kind of a stand on abortion. And on your website, you do take a stand, but that's only your personal stand. You have no, and again, abortion is not something that a president can do anything about anyway. But anyway, like I said, I noticed on your website, you do take a stand that you do not approve of abortion.
Yeah, I mean, since you've been to my website, you know that I take a stand on about just about everything, because I want no other candidate does this. The LP president, well, no other candidate ever does it, because I want people to know what libertarianism is all about. And I've always believed that our principles and our positions are our greatest asset. You know, all too many LP members think they're a liability, they're an albatross. And I saw this when I was on the platform committee. Oh, we got to abolish this plank and this plank because it's costing us votes. And I said, that's ridiculous. The real problem is that y'all don't know how to defend these positions, and that's the problem. But on the abortion thing, I agree that I don't think the party ought to take a collective stance. I think it's misleading. You know, the majority vote, let's say it's pro-choice. I've had people say to me, I would never vote libertarian because y'all are pro-choice. And so I have to stop them and I say, well, it's not that black and white, because I would say it's about 65-35 or 60-40, maybe 55-45. There's a lot of pro-life people in the party. So I've reached the conclusion that you're just better off not collectively making a position on abortion and binding everybody else on the opposite side, and just let each libertarian make his own stand on where he is. I mean, I'm a devout Catholic, I'm pro-life, but this has been in all the years since I discovered libertarianism, this has been the most difficult issue for me to analyze and try to figure out, and what's the right approach. Because I know that there's people that in good conscience do not believe that life begins at conception. And so I have trouble with this. You know, I consider it murder. Obviously, that's a logical conclusion, but for some reason, I don't feel it's murder like premeditated murder of a live person, and I don't know how I reconcile that within myself. I still struggle with it, so I don't have all the answers on abortion.
You pretty clearly make that you make that pretty clear that it is your stance, not the party stance.
Exactly. I think the party's, well, I don't know what the plank says now, to be honest with you, but when I was around in the platform committee, it was always pro-choice. But it was about it.
I believe right now the party's position is they take no stance.
Okay.
We removed both at the state level and in Reno.
Okay. Well, I like that. I don't think it ought to take a stance. Let each person take the stand. And that way, the party members that are not in the majority do not get bound up in a declaration of what the party stands for. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like we're kind of running out of questions. Anyone else have anything else? I guess
No, but Jacob, thank you so much for
yes.
being so generous with your time. We really appreciate it. I'll be contacting you, and now I'm drawing a blank on his name, but we'll invite you back to address the state convention next April. So I'll contact you regarding that.
That'd be great, Howard. Yeah, well, no, the
Howard.
thanks are mine, guys. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to expound on my views and freely. I mean, you know, you guys didn't interrupt when I was giving these long answers. I'm very grateful for that. And thanks for the opportunity. I'm most appreciative. I assume you guys will be posting this online.
Yes, actually, I'm I'm kind of new a little bit at this Zoom stuff, and I didn't turn the recording on till about 20 minutes into it, but I will record. I did record it then. I think it only records the audio, but I will Sid, you know more about that. Does it record the audio or the video?
Both.
Both. Okay.
Yep.
And Sid, before I can post it anywhere, you gotta fix me.
So when it does get posted, Jacob, I will forward you the link to it.
That'd be great. That's why that little screen popped up and said recording right
Yeah.
in the middle of our conversation.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Sounds great, guys. Well, thank you very much. I'm most appreciative. I hear my dog barking downstairs. She's got to take a break. So I'm going to head on down and take her out.
Okay. Sid.
Thanks a lot, Jacob.
Thank y'all.
Take care.
Bye-bye.